Hi everyone, welcome to the webinar. My name is Kelsey Taylor with the Fraser Basin Council, and I am the program coordinator for the Salmon-Safe B.C. program, and I'll be the host of today's session. I'm here in our Vancouver office with our Salmon-Safe B.C. team, including Teresa Fresco, our program manager, Christine Doiron, our communications coordinator, as well as Randy Sharp, who is one of our Salmon-Safe assessors who's going to be presenting today. We're hosting this webinar from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. I want to acknowledge the important work that Indigenous communities have been doing since time out of mind to steward the lands and waters where we're living and working today, and especially our salmon. This webinar, the Introduction to Salmon-Safe Standards for Urban Development, is the last in a three-part series called An Introduction to Salmon-Safe Certification for Urban Development. The series began back in February 2018 with our first webinar, providing an introduction to our urban development certification program, and continued with our second webinar in October 2019, giving an overview of the benefits of Salmon-Safe certification. These webinars are a fairly new communications tool for the Salmon-Safe BC program, and we're very excited to see the level of interest and support for the delivery. Please stay tuned at the end of the webinar for more information about upcoming sessions. Also, don't forget to like our Facebook and Twitter pages for the latest news on Salmon-Safe activities and events, and our Fraser Basin Council YouTube channel to access recordings of all of our webinars. Of course, this webinar series would not be possible without the support of our funders and supporters listed here. We wanted to give a big thank you for their generous contributions to enable the Salmon-Safe BC program to do its important work. So before we jump into the webinar program, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping points. The first is audio. You may notice that I have a blanket mute on all attendees. Because we're expecting a large number of participants, this is just to ensure that we don't get any background noise or feedback that may interrupt the webinar presentation. We will have a question and answer period at the end of the presentation. So if you do have any questions or comments that you'd like us to address, please enter it into the question box that you can find on the GoToWebinar menu. The questions will come to us, and when we get to that section of the agenda, I will be reading those questions out in the order that we have received them. And we just wanted to acknowledge our audience for our session today. We have about 33 people currently on the line, and we have folks registered from all orders of government, including First Nations, the development sector, environmental professionals, and more. And thank you all for joining us. So today's session will aim to provide an introduction to the Salmon-Safe certification standards for urban development. We'll be hearing from members of the Salmon-Safe assessment team who specialize in a number of disciplines, including biology, stormwater engineering, landscape architecture, and integrated pest management. We're going to have 5 short presentations from our speakers, followed by a question and answer session, and then we'll wrap up. If you're interested in referencing the standards during this webinar or afterwards, you can find the document in the handout section, drop-down of the GoToWebinar menu. And I'm very excited to introduce our 5 speakers that will be joining us today. Firstly, Teresa Fresco, our Salmon-Safe BC program manager, will provide an overview of the Salmon-Safe BC certification standards. Patrick Lilly, a senior biologist at Kerwood Lydell, will go over our erosion prevention and sediment control standards. Chris Webb, principal engineer at Herrera, will go over the stormwater management standards. Randy Sharp, who is a consultant and researcher in living architecture and green infrastructure, will dive into the water use management and enhancement of urban ecological function standards. And finally, Tasha Murray, Executive Director of the Invasive Species Council of Metro Vancouver, will tell us about the integrated pest management standards. So go for it, Teresa.
Yeah, thanks, Kelsey. And hello, everybody in cyberspace. Thanks to everyone on the line for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to be providing an overview of the standards to set the stage for our speakers. But before I do so, I did want to encourage those who may not be familiar with the Salmon-Safe BC program as a whole to view our introduction to urban certification and our benefits of urban certification webinars on the Fraser Basin Council YouTube channel. Kelsey will be providing more details on how to access those recordings at the end of this session, so stay tuned. So Salmon-Safe BC is one of Canada's first peer-reviewed certification programs that recognizes and promotes urban land and water management practices that mitigate impacts on our watersheds and, of course, our salmon. Salmon-Safe actually began in the United States in 1997 by the Pacific Rivers Council in Oregon, and over the years has evolved into its own nonprofit and regional eco-label. It is delivered through a network of partner organizations that you can see there on the map, along the Cascadia corridor as far south as the northern tip of California and as far north as Alaska, and now here, of course, on this side of the border in BC. Salmon-Safe BC launched in 2010, beginning with the agriculture certification program, and then in 2013 it launched its urban certification program. And since late 2018, all the Salmon-Safe programs have transitioned to Fraser Basin Council, and now we are the sole delivery organization for all of Salmon-Safe BC. So the Salmon-Safe standards were really inspired by more than a decade of work by the U.S. Agriculture Project team, who worked with producers to improve their land management practices to mitigate impacts to salmon. Driven by what they saw in that work as both an ecological and market need, the co-founders of Salmon-Safe put together a multidisciplinary team of scientists, fish biologists, engineers, and academic researchers to develop a set of certification standards that were based on the biological needs of salmon. These standards were then piloted and peer-reviewed by the science and academic community and U.S. regulatory agencies. A similar review of the U.S. standards was completed here in BC with some BC-based scientists and academics before the launch of the Urban Certification Program in 2013. The BC review team found that the standards were appropriate for the BC context and they were adopted for the program. What makes Salmon-Safe such a unique eco-certification program is its independence from sector or organizational specific definitions of sustainability. In addition to protecting salmon as a keystone species and indicator of broader watershed and ecosystem health, the standards also intend to promote landscape-level conservation and protection of biological diversity. So as you will hear from our Salmon-Safe assessors shortly, there are 5 core urban development standards for urban certification. And these are stormwater management, water use management, which typically pertains to external water use, primarily irrigation for landscaping, erosion prevention and sediment control. This is typically assessed during the site's construction phase. Pesticide reduction and water quality protection, and this typically pertains to treatment of the landscaping on site, but also water quality during the construction phase, and overall enhancement of urban ecological function. And this typically pertains to the overall biodiversity values of the site. So this can include elements such as pollinator pathways, use of native species, etc. There are 2 context-dependent standards for sites that do contain a water body within the site boundary, and those 2 are in-stream habitat protection and restoration, and riparian, wetland, and locally significant vegetation protection and restoration. So I'll pause there and pass it back to Kelsey.
Thanks, Teresa. So now I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Patrick Lilly is a senior biologist and project manager in Kerwood Lydell's Greater Vancouver office. For the past decade, a primary focus of Patrick's work has been reducing the impacts of urbanization and restoring and enhancing aquatic habitat in developed watersheds. He has helped to develop 10 integrated stormwater management plans for local governments in BC. Recently, he was the lead author of Diversity by Design, a guidance document for species at risk habitat restoration on the BC South Coast. Patrick is also a certified erosion and sediment control lead in BC. So take it away, Patrick.
Great. Thank you, Kelsey. Good afternoon, everybody. Look forward to telling you a little bit about my experience working with the Salmon-Safe Urban standards. As Kelsey mentioned, I'm a senior biologist, and I've been a Salmon-Safe assessor in BC for about 3 years, working, and actually I've worked on both sides of projects, both with clients who are interested in pursuing the salmon certification, as well as doing assessments of particular projects as well. So as Kelsey mentioned, I'm going to talk about I'm actually going to talk about erosion prevention and sediment control as the main part of my brief presentation here, but I'm also going to touch on the context-dependent standards, since I think these are relevant to my area as a biologist and are the assessment pieces that I get involved in the work that I do. So again, erosion and prevention and sediment control is part of the core urban certification standards, and so this standard applies to all urban development sites that would be assessed under the Salmon-Safe certification. And then the in-stream habitat protection and restoration and the riparian wetland and vegetation protection and restoration standard are context-dependent certification standards, and these would only apply to certain sites, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Again, these standards can apply to either new or existing projects, so whether we're certifying a site at the kind of planning stage before a project is developed, or an existing project that's applied for certification. So just to talk a little bit more about erosion prevention and sediment control, why does this matter from a salmon-safe protection perspective? Well, in urban environments, sediment has potential impacts to fish and streams. So sediment that originates from urban development sites is a major cause of habitat degradation in fish-bearing streams. So how does that occur? Well, when sediment enters a water body, it can actually have direct impacts on fish that may be present in a creek or a stream. So the sediment can actually interfere with the gill function of particular fish. Sediment can also block sunlight, and that has potential impacts on the food web in terms of the production of food within a stream that fish depend on. And then if we have, in a stream, if we have eggs that are actually incubating in the gravel of that stream, the sediment can fill the spaces between the gravel and can actually suffocate fish eggs and other bottom-dwelling organisms. So sediment can have potential large impacts on fish and streams, and particularly on salmon. So this is why we care about erosion and sediment control in terms of the Salmon-Safe program. And you may think that, well, you know, if I'm doing a development and it's not in a watershed that actually has a salmon-bearing stream or a fish-bearing stream, you know, there's a lot of areas of Vancouver that where the actual where the runoff would go to the ocean rather than the stream. You know, you may think, well, this standard doesn't matter to me. We can allow erosion and that's not going to be an issue. But the reality is that sediment can also have big impacts to important marine nearshore environments. All of our stormwater that runs off eventually ends up in the ocean in our region. And so particularly sensitive habitats like eelgrass beds or kelp forests are potentially impacted by sediment and that's found in urban runoff. So again, no one is exempt from this standard. So what types of things do we look for as assessors when we're applying the erosion and prevention and sediment control standards? So I'll talk in kind of two different phases of a project. So at the project planning and design phase, we're typically looking for a number of things that the project will have done to address potential erosion prevention and sediment control concerns. The first is that there's a good understanding of the site, particularly the soil characteristics and the risk factors for erosion. So this can include things like steep slopes on the site, particularly fine soils that are very highly erodible, that might be easily transported in rainfall and runoff into the storm drain system. We want to see that the project has minimized its ground disturbance, its footprint. So as much as possible, disturbance of natural soils and vegetation is minimized, and that again minimizes the amount of soil that's available to erode and end up in salmon streams or other ecosystems. A big part of this application of the standard from an assessor perspective is really focused on looking at the erosion and sediment control plan for a site, and specifically the appropriate measures and the sizing of those measures are appropriate for the development that's proposed and the conditions of the site and the climate as well. And Finally, we want to see that there's a good understanding and adherence to the local ESC bylaw and requirements. So a lot of local municipalities in BC have erosion and sediment control bylaws, and we want to see that the project understands those requirements and is applying those requirements appropriately. So just to give you a quick example of what an erosion and sediment control plan looks like, these are the types of features in a plan we'll be looking at. So things like, are there appropriate measures to reduce the amount of sediment that is running off the site? So these would be things like stockpile protection, shown in red here, where soil may be stored for periods of time during the development. We want to see that there's areas where sediment is being treated and removed. So features like check dams within ditches or runoff corridors, sediment basins where sediment is allowed to settle out before water discharges from the site, and then things like silt fences to control the perimeter of the site and ensure that sediment is not running off in non-designated areas from the site. So again, this erosion and sediment control, usually part of the engineering drawings of the project. We spend a lot of time looking at this in terms of assessing the standard. And again, some typical measures for erosion prevention and sediment control. So a silt fence at the perimeter of a site, an example of a stockpile of soil that's covered with plastic to prevent the soil from eroding into the stormwater system on the site. A settling pond and diversion system that was set up for a particular site that I've worked on, and even in urban sites, we're often dealing with sediment treatment systems that actually use more of a system or potentially chemicals to remove sediment as well. So these again are in more urban sites where there's limited space to deal with sediment-laden water. And then moving to the construction phase. So once a project is under construction, we also want to look for some things in relation to the standard. So one, that there's regular monitoring by a qualified professional. That's a typical thing we look for. That monitoring reports are being issued on the status of the erosion and sediment control measures. We want to see that erosion and sediment control measures are regularly maintained. So that often these measures require maintenance on a regular basis as rainfall occurs and runoff occurs, and things like catch basin inserts need to be cleaned out, or silt fence needs to be cleaned out. So we want to see that that's being done. And if there are issues that arise through the monitoring, we want to see that those issues are rectified quickly so that they don't become environmental issues and impact salmon habitat. So briefly, I'm also just going to touch on the context-dependent fish habitat protection standards. So when do these apply? So typically, these context-dependent fish habitat protection standards apply when any of these types of habitats are within the boundary of the development. So a stream or another type of watercourse. So again, actual fish habitat. But it could also include other features as well. So things like a development that's on a lake shore or a marine shoreline, or if a stream is nearby to the development, but the development is in a part of the riparian zone of that stream, then these context-dependent standards would apply. When there's wetlands or other sensitive or important habitat types. So these could include sensitive ecosystems that are rare within the region that we might want to protect as well. Again, just quickly, the reason why this standard is important, the stream and the riparian zone are very important to fish. Just again, a reminder of some of the benefits of why we preserve vegetation along streams. So it provides a buffer between development and the aquatic habitat where fish live. This buffer provides shade, it provides nutrients, it introduces structural features like wood into creeks and streams, and all of that supports healthy fish and salmon populations. Riparianers also filter runoff from developed areas, so they're again important for maintaining that buffer between development and the natural habitats where fish live. And so again, just talking about the project planning and design phase, with these standards, we're looking that, again, you're knowing your site. So before development is planned, so things like a biophysical inventory and assessment, whatever habitat it's done that exists there, whether it's a stream, riparian, or wetland habitat, or significant vegetation, that is done and the site is understood. That fish habitat enhancement and restoration opportunities have been identified. So things like barrier removal or actual in-stream and riparian habitat improvements that could be done as part of the development. We also want to see that best practices to minimize the project footprint have been done. So we want to see that projects are trying to avoid impacts to these sensitive habitats. If they can't avoid them, then they're appropriately mitigating them and only using offsetting of impacts as a last resort. And typically, we also like to see projects have an environmental management plan in place that is guiding some of these protection of some of these areas during the construction process. And finally, during the construction phase, we're looking again at monitoring by someone who's qualified to make sure that the appropriate measures are being taken to protect fish and riparian habitat. And that specific measures are being taken as well. So things like work buffers and protective fencing are being utilized, that there's respect for the in-stream work windows, or also things like bird nesting windows, which are another important environmental consideration. And a big focus is also looking at invasive plant management within construction sites. So how are those issues being dealt with, and is the site being protected from potentially being invaded by invasive species, which can reduce the quality of fish habitat on a site. So these are the types of things that as a biologist and an assessor, we're looking at under these particular standards when we look at certifying a potential site under the Salmon-Safe certification. Kelsey, back to you.
All right, thanks so much, Patrick. So now I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who is Chris Webb. Chris is the Principal Civil Engineer with Herrera Environmental Consultants in Bellingham, Washington. Chris has been working for 25 years to make sustainable civil engineering less of an oxymoron. His practice is focused on the planning and design of green stormwater infrastructure and high-performance green building projects for public and private clients, from the watershed to the site scale. So whenever you're ready, Chris.
Okay. Sure, I'm just trying to get the correct screen here. Sorry, this is... sorry, are you... There we go. All right,
There it is.
There it is. Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry for that technical glitch. Yeah, so I'd like to start a little bit with the big picture and kind of recall that, you know, really water is finite. These dots, I think, are really always compelling to me, with those bubbles representing the total water on Earth, the amount of fresh water, and then that little tiny blue dot is the amount of accessible fresh water. And so this is a precious resource that we need to really work together to protect, and that's why we're here. Water, of course, is a renewable resource, and water passes through our site in this endless cycle that we've all learned about in high school. And but it's important to really remember that our project really sits in the context, as Patrick was saying, of a watershed, and to recall that no matter where our project is, there's really always someone downstream of us, be it a person or a fish or an ecosystem. And so really, when we are managing water on our site, it's really, we're just really borrowing water, and we're really just stewarding it as it's passing through our site in this endless cycle. And so we really need to focus on implementing systems on our projects that are, you know, when the water is within our control, to really steward it to the highest and best use, and to really think about those ecosystems that are downstream of us. Here's some quotes from the US EPA, and really urban stormwater runoff is really the major reason why so many of our water bodies are failing to meet water quality standards. You know, a lot of the piped industrial sources and so forth are in the process of, you know, being dealt with, but really stormwater runoff is really the lion's share of those pollutants, and we really need to be upping our game on our projects to be a good steward of ecological resources. And so it kind of goes to kind of a bit of a review here. We have, the disposition, and someone should mute their line there. So we've got a typical healthy forested ecosystem on the left showing the kind of disposition of precipitation as it falls on a forest. And it's really interesting to note there just how little of the runoff is, how little of the precipitation that falls on a typical forest actually develops as runoff. The large majority of the water is held in the shallow and deep groundwater and also returned to the atmosphere through evapotranspiration. And so when we created development and we're managing the hydrology and we're trying to really replicate those healthy kind of forested watersheds, it's a real challenge that we have to manage the volume in a way that really reduces that amount of runoff by reducing our impervious surfaces and employing best management practices that infiltrate and retain that water on site. And so when we're evaluating permanent stormwater controls on a project under Salmon-Safe, we're really having this framework in mind and really looking at both looking at volume and also water quality. Another way to look at it is really, trying to have that sponge effect. How do we build that kind of storage and retention and slow release into our projects through best management, green stormwater infrastructure or gray stormwater infrastructure best management practices. So here I have the Salmon-Safe stormwater management requirement, and really it's at the emphasis I'm showing there and in the last line where we're really minimizing the volume and it's really the volume and to some extent the rate that stormwater leaves our site, and also focusing on stormwater quality. And it's always important to understand, because this is frequently confused, that we need to be focused both on the volume of stormwater, which is about retention. And when we're retaining stormwater on site, we're either using it for another purpose like toilet flushing and a rainwater collection and reuse system, or we're infiltrating it into the ground through a green stormwater practice, or we're using evapotranspiration perhaps on a green roof. And that's really about retention, where the volume of stormwater never leaves our site. The second way that we can influence the runoff that's leaving our site is around detention. And this idea of retention and detention are frequently confused. And that detention doesn't address volume, it addresses simply the rate of stormwater leaving our site, which can also be important. The rate and the duration of those higher flows can lead to degradation of stream habitat. But when we're looking at a progressive green stormwater infrastructure-based stormwater management system, the large emphasis is really on the volume retention, on the infiltration. And then lastly is water quality, where we want to be sure that the water that does leave our site both has the quality that is not going to impair habitat, both during construction, as Patrick mentioned, but then also in our post-construction condition where we're providing treatment to those pollution-generating impervious surfaces. Patrick mentioned, when we're focused the construction phase, water quality issues, and really then once those are addressed, we need to be putting practices in place that deal with the permanent water quality performance of the project, and particularly diverting runoff, particularly from pollution-generating impervious surfaces, to a permanent stormwater treatment BMP, because stormwater really is a really complex cocktail of pollutants, and some of them are listed there that can be kind of acute lethal effects to fish and also long-term sublethal effects. So Patrick covered the erosion control during construction phase really well. Just wanted to note that these two pictures on the lower left were from a recent Salmon-Safe certification that the team I was part of down in the Seattle area. We've got some mechanical treatment and also some sedimentation ponds there. And then also looking at our pollutant source control, making sure that where we can prevent pollutants from entering the runoff in the first place is always our preferred option over treatment. And permanent water quality is really kind of breaks down broadly into, gray solutions, which can be vaulted filters like you're seeing there, which is a modular wetland system, or green infrastructure, which is growing. The scientific understanding of these systems is growing rapidly, and they are green stormwater infrastructure used to be fairly poorly understood and more of a fringe kind of idea, but the more science has come to light on its performance, its value is really, really being understood. And really, at the end of the day, I think what we are learning is that it's really a hybrid of gray and green solutions together is really the answer. And different projects will have different mixes of those things, but a gray-green system is really, because each gray and green systems each have benefits, and they can be highly complementary. And then another thing that Salmon-Safe plays a particularly close focus on is source control in the permanent condition. Metals can be detrimental to fish, and so several Salmon-Safe certifications have really looked at particularly exterior galvanizing, where we've got exposed hot dip galvanized building materials that are going to be leaching zinc directly into stormwater. And that's something that Salmon-Safe frequently comments on and really works to avoid that exterior galvanizing to really avoid that zinc pollution. Water quantity is also key, and here we've got green stormwater infrastructure, which I mentioned does both water quality and addresses retention. The middle picture there is our recent Salmon-Safe team assessing the MEC flagship store with many of the folks that are on the call here today. And then I'm just showing an example of a gray solution, a detention vault, a simple detention vault. But really the bias that we have is toward green solutions because they offer so much more value in terms of performance and co-benefits. And water quantity really does address habitat. There's a direct connection. This is showing a healthy stream on the left, where a healthy stream channel, and you can see those same hydrologic, the arrow showing the disposition of stormwater, and when we increase the volume, the rate and duration of the surface stormwater flows, we incise the channel, and that causes habitat loss. So to conclude, when we are doing Salmon-Safe certification and we are evaluating permanent stormwater controls, we really are looking for those projects, those opportunities to go above and beyond code. And so we'll be helping teams both identify those and rewarding those who implement those things with certification. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Chris. So our next speaker is Randy Sharp. Randy established a practice in Vancouver in 1980 that grew into Sharp and Diamond Landscape Architecture Incorporated, committed to ecological-based solutions for site development that blends landscape and architecture. He recently retired from the firm to focus on urban design, writing and teaching, as well as consulting in living architecture, green infrastructure, and water management. Mr. Sharp is a guest lecturer in the city program at SFU and the Center for Architectural Ecology at BCIT. He's also a green roof professional and has designed over 100 green roofs, living wells, and vertical landscapes for a wide range of building types. So whenever you're ready, Randy.
Thank you very much. It is indeed a pleasure to participate in this very informative webinar and an honor to serve as a Salmon-Safe assessor. At Sharp and Diamond Landscape Architecture, we collaborated with the development team on the first 2 urban sites in BC to be Salmon-Safe certified, the MEC Mountain Equipment Co-op head office, and YVR, the Vancouver International Airport. I will present an introduction to the standards and performance requirements for water use management, as well as enhancement of urban ecological function. Besides MEC, I include slides of other projects in BC that feature living architecture and green infrastructure. They are like stepping stones, often isolated sites or fragments in the urban fabric. Salmon-Safe is all about ecological conductivity and visible water connections. What happens upstream can impact water quality and ecological function on site, and what the site discharges downstream impacts salmonoid and other species that rely on clean, abundant water in streams and other water bodies. Nearly 40 billion liters of raw sewage mixed with untreated stormwater flow directly into the Fraser River and the Pacific Ocean, which includes English Bay, Falls Creek, and the Burrard Inlet each year. There are 27 combined sewer outfalls, or CSOs, in the city of Vancouver. They've got a massive battle. Fortunately, the Metro Vancouver is upgrading the Iona Island sewage treatment plant for 2030, and I've been pushing council and the engineering department to try to eliminate as many CSOs as possible before 2030. We need champions at the City Hall to push for blue-green roof policies, as well as revising transportation standards to reduce the width of Vancouver streets, eliminate free curbside parking in residential neighborhoods, and reduce the requirements for underground parking. There is good news. The City of Vancouver's Green Infrastructure Branch is considering Salmon-Safe certification for their department. Vancouver Coastal Health closed beaches around English Bay during the summer due to elevated E. coli counts. The toxic sewage and stormwater flowing out of the CSOs is also degrading the marine environment, partly causing record low numbers of coho salmon returning to the Fraser River. Consequently, the southern resident killer whales are starving and are at risk of extinction. The City of Vancouver's Green Infrastructure Branch has designated 18 watersheds within the city. They are starting to address the worst combined sewer outflows in the watersheds along the Canby corridor. Construction of the Canada Line subway and underground parking structures may have penetrated the impervious cap of the Quadra Sands aquifer, causing exfiltration and CSOs even during the summer. I don't have a picture of it, but there's the Quadra Sands aquifer underlays half of the city of Vancouver. It's like a lake, but filled with sands and gravels, and it's both a great opportunity to extract fresh groundwater, as well as a liability if not handled properly. The Salmon-Safe evaluation and certification process is a collaborative effort. All certification standards are performance-based, not prescriptive, in order to give the development team freedom to be innovative and to create site-specific designs. Salmon-Safe assessors are real people. This is not a numbers game, unlike other third-party verification programs. Salmon-Safe takes a holistic approach, looking at the big picture of the site in context with the watershed and the region. Salmon-Safe's overarching goal is to improve ecological systems and watershed health by connecting urban sites to waterways and wildlife corridors. Habitat patches can be interconnected with green roofs, living walls, rain gardens, hedgerows, and high canopy trees planted in continuous tree trenches. First, I'll talk about standard U2. That means you can do it too. Water use management. Because it rains a lot on the West Coast, we often take water for granted. Water conservation benefits salmonoids and other species that rely on clean, abundant water in salmon streams by reducing the amount of wastewater being discharged. Standards for water management. Start by preparing a site water infrastructure inventory of water use and disposal. Install water-efficient toilets, faucets, laundry, showers, and HVAC systems. Provide rainwater harvest, water reuse, and where possible, wastewater reclamation to create potable drinking water. Connect sanitary systems to the public infrastructure. This picture is MEC head office under construction. This is a 60,000 liter cistern that collects water off the clean green roof and is available for flushing toilets, landscape irrigation, and other non-potable water uses. Continuing with the standards for urban water use management, where possible, specify water-wise landscape planting to limit water demand by using native and drought-tolerant species. Use water conservation practices for site and landscape maintenance. Clean equipment off-site and away from riparian areas or wetlands. And avoid surface water withdrawals during construction. Prepare a water conservation plan for the property managers. And next, I will talk about standard U5, which is the enhancement of urban ecological function. Urban settings can host a surprising array of wildlife, including birds, bats, bees, and other pollinators, with ecological benefits far beyond the immediate site. Design and develop urban sites to provide quality habitat, promote ecological corridors, and watershed health. And standards include start by providing landscape mapping of habitat patches and wildlife corridors in the local region. Conduct a survey of existing species of birds, mammals, insects, and invertebrates in the area, and work with the city or the approving authorities to create synergies with adjacent properties or corridors. Develop strategies for the creation and retention of habitat, tree canopy, and pollination paths. Provide for dark skies with full cutoff lighting, and design facades and glazing that mitigate bird kills. Protect wildlife and provide temporary habitat during construction. Use non-invasive plants and maintenance strategies providing food, forage, and refuge for wildlife. This last slide is about the transformation of a 1960s shopping mall into transforming into the Hillside Center in Victoria. These images illustrate linear rain gardens and continuous tree trenches capped by permeable pavers to capture and treat stormwater before entering Balker Creek. In summary, by promoting ecological corridors, protecting wildlife habitat, and managing rainwater on site, watershed health will improve. Salmon-Safe offers the tools, resources, and support for providing interconnected ecological development. After certification and annual verification of management practices, habitat restoration, and facility performance verify that the project functions as designed. I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Randy. I just want to quickly acknowledge, I know we've been having a little bit of technical difficulties with our screen size. That should be back to normal now, but we're working on it. So now I'm going to introduce our final speaker, Tasha Murray, who is the Executive Director of the Invasive Species Council of Metro Vancouver. Tasha has been involved in conservation in the Pacific Northwest for over 15 years and has worked extensively to manage invasive plants. She previously worked as the coordinator of the Vancouver Aquarium's River Works program, an aquatic stewardship initiative focused on volunteer-based restoration projects. She's worked for the Invasive Species Council of Metro Vancouver since 2008, and as the executive director, she is currently leading the Invasive Species Council team. Her passions at the ISCMB are the outreach and education program and running behind the scenes of the society, and she lives in Burnaby with her family on a small acreage with a large garden, chickens, and plenty of invasive plants to tackle. So looking forward to hearing from you, Tasha.
Thank you. I'm not going to disclose which particular invasives I deal with, but it's more than one. I believe that I am the newest member of the Salmon-Safe B.C. assessment team. I joined in spring 2019, and I'm so pleased to be here. As someone who focuses on invasive species and pest management, I really enjoy helping other people do their jobs better by helping them manage whatever pest issues they might be dealing with. And with Salmon-Safe B.C, I love being part of something bigger than just IPM. I like working together with experts from different backgrounds and perspectives to contribute in a meaningful way to sustainability. So I'm pleased to tell you a bit about the IPM and Salmon-Safe Standards. So integrated pest management is essentially a decision-making process for managing pests in an effective, economical, and environmentally sound way. So an IPM approach can be used for crop management, it can be used at development sites, and even in the home garden. And techniques used in IPM management programs can vary from preventative to the use of biological, physical, cultural, or chemical control methods. And one or several measures may be coordinated into an IPM program to target a single pest or possibly multiple pests. And by pests, I mean lots of different things. Any living thing has potential to be a pest. It could be plants, insects, or other animals, funguses, or pathogens. Probably many of you can think of pests that you might deal with in your own life, whether personally or professionally. Especially in our urban environments, it's very rare to find a site that hasn't been impacted in some way by pests, and so it likely impacts all of us. So my focus today is talking about the standards for pesticide reduction and water quality protection. So a little bit about why we're concerned about pests in the first place. They have a number of different impacts. I'm going to start with ecological or environmental. In the top photo, you can see an estuary ecosystem that's being dominated by an invasive plant called purple loosestrife. It's essentially created what we call a monoculture, where there's the one invasive plant dominating the ecosystem. So that's bad news for all of the native plants that require that kind of habitat to grow. And it's also impacting all of the other living things, animals that require those native plants for habitat and for food. And so there are a number of different ways that invasives are impacting our natural ecosystems. They're especially devastating to sensitive and aquatic habitats. Some invasive plants and invasive fish can have a direct impact on salmon and salmon habitat. I'm going to pick on the knotweeds a little bit. Some knotweeds shown in the bottom photo there. They're among the province's highest priority invasive species to manage, and knotweed outcompetes with native plants, which feed on the things that salmon eat. Knotweed can weaken stream banks and cause erosion issues, so it's particularly problematic in exactly the habitat that you see on the screen, where knotweed is largely taking over the far side of that riparian area. And knotweed and other invasives can also reduce shade, which is important for salmon habitat. There are also economic impacts to pests. Pretty much every major sector in BC is impacted in some way by pests. So forestry, ranching, agriculture, tourism. Also invasives and pests are extremely costly to manage. There's another photo of knotweed there. You're going to care about knotweed if it's growing through your asphalt or impacting infrastructure at a site that you're working on. And even beyond your particular site, invasive species and pests are capable of spread. So even if you don't have a water body on your property, if invasive species or pests are left unmanaged, they can spread and have an impact far beyond the site you're managing. They can have larger effects for the entire watershed. And just also want to mention that some of our pests actually pose health and safety impacts for people and for pets. That last photo on the top is giant hogweed, which is a highly toxic plant. This photo was staged to show how easy it might be for people or outdoor workers to come in contact with this plant. And that's definitely a pest that land managers are really having to deal with because they don't want people to get burned or otherwise injured coming in contact with this plant. But some other health and safety impacts could be reducing visibility and sightlines on roadways, erosion, or again, damaging infrastructure can also be a safety issue. So as a salmon-safe assessor with the IPM lens, some of the spaces and things that I'm looking for when I do an assessment start even before I get on site. I might be looking at landscape plans. And then once we're on site, I might be looking for places where pests may live or places where there might be pathways for the introduction of pests, locations of chemical use and storage, designated animal areas. An example might be a designated dog run. Any landscape vegetation or natural areas that might be present on the site, construction staging areas, and sites where equipment and vehicles might be stored, cleaned, or fueled. I'm going to provide a highlight of some of the IPM standards. So first one is identifying high-risk areas where chemical use and storage should be avoided. We want to make sure that those have been identified and mapped. And some of those high-risk areas might include wetlands or other sensitive water bodies, areas on steep slopes or unstable soils. We're looking for landscape plans that require minimal chemical or nutrient use, if any. And with respect to landscape vegetation, we're looking to see that they're either made up of native plants or hardy, non-invasive plants, again, requiring minimal chemical application, if any. You might be familiar with Himalayan blackberry, which here on the south coast is probably the most widespread invasive species that we deal with. You can see it's totally covering what is quite a steep slope there. That's definitely something that I would be watching for doing an assessment. Other standards, construction activities minimize the movement of invasive plant parts like seeds, chemicals or other toxic substances to and from the site. The use of pesticides or chemicals are avoided as much as possible, especially within riparian and wetland buffer zones. Mechanical and manual removal of invasive plants is chosen over chemical treatments when best practice allows. There's a worker in the top photo there using a special tool allowing her to remove a Scotch broom shrub. So that's an example of manual control. We're looking for the implementation of an integrated pest management plan consistent with Salmon-Safe standards. So do you know what pests are on site or what pests could potentially come on site, and what is the plan to manage those? That bottom photo is of European fire ants, another species that we deal with here in BC, definitely something you don't want to have on your property. Salmon-Safe also incorporates a list of urban high hazard risk pesticide list. And so that's available in the standards if you want a better quality list of the things that are on there. So high hazard pesticides can be a serious threat to salmon and other aquatic life. The pesticide formulations can contain a number of different ingredients that can be toxic, including the active ingredients themselves. And high hazard pesticides can impact fish in a number of different ways. They can kill fish, they can stress juveniles, they can alter swimming ability, interrupt schooling behavior, they can cause salmon to seek suboptimal water temperatures and inhibit migration and delay spawning. And so those identify high hazards. We're looking to see that they're not being used at the site. So in summary, some of the things that I'm looking for are what species are present at the site? Do you know what you have? Do you have a plan to manage them? Are you protecting aquatic and sensitive areas of the site? Is there minimal or no chemical or nutrient use? Are you using native or non-invasive plants? And essentially, do you have a management plan for your pests, such as common tansy, the yellow flower shown in the photo? Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Tasha. So now we're going to move into the question and answer part of our webinar. And just a reminder to folks that when you have a question, you can just enter it into the questions drop-down in the GoToWebinar menu. And yeah, we're going to be reading them out in the order that we get them. So our first question is from Jennifer Pierce, who's a planner for Bowen Island. So the question is the Salmon-Safe certification program frequently applied to rural areas? How applicable is it in these conditions? So the answer is yes. Salmon-Safe certification can be applied to both rural and urban areas. The BC projects so far in Metro Vancouver have been in Metro Vancouver, but that's not to say that they can be applied BC-wide. So I'm wondering if Chris might be able to provide an example or two from the US?
Sure, yeah, I have worked on the assessment of rural and urban projects. Recently just certified 2 trail projects for King County parks. And so, yeah, working out in the rural area. So absolutely, the methodology and the certification would apply.
Great. All right, thanks, Chris. Yeah, so this question, I'm just going to put it out to all the panelists. So I'm wondering if anyone could give me an example of where the Salmon-Safe standards have been applied in a really innovative way, just to kind of give a case study of the standards. So yeah, I'm not sure if anyone wants to jump in.
Well, the MEC head office was the first urban site in BC to be certified, and that's when MEC had big budgets. They're under a bit of a financial crunch right now, but they were certainly pushing the envelope, pushing us on the design team, and fully integrated input from their employees. So starting at the top, there's both extensive and intensive rooftop gardens with urban agriculture, which are accessible to staff and visitors. The building has amazing green building performance attributes. I won't go into those, but water management, as you may have seen from the slide, water is directed from the roof down to rain gardens, as well as clean water off a small area of white TPO roof goes into the 60,000 liter cistern. So that, I believe, is on your website. There's more information. And if you just Google MEC head office Salmon-Safe, there's quite a few articles available.
Awesome. Thanks, Randy.
Yeah, I think it's also just good to note that Salmon-Safe has been applied to projects of different types, but also been applied to jurisdictions and programs. And I think that's particularly innovative at the standards, because it's an expert-driven system, can be highly, can be uniquely adapted to all sorts of situations, from certifying a municipal park operations program to a trail to an urban site and so forth.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, so we've got another question from Jordan McCauley. So the question is, there seems to be a lot of overlap with pretty common best practices, as well as with other programs such as the U.S. Green Building Center programs, such as Sustainable Sites Initiative. So the question is, how does Salmon-Safe go above and beyond? So I might throw this to Teresa first.
Yeah, so thanks for the question, Jordan. And that's a common question that we get often is how does Salmon-Safe speak to all of the other eco certification and building certification programs out there? And they do. There is a level of complementarity and alignment with existing programs. And just as a shout out to our Fraser Basin Council YouTube page, I do encourage you to take a look at our Intro to Salmon-Safe Urban certification, because we do go into how that level of complementarity works. But just to acknowledge your example with the Sustainable Sites Initiative, we have done a series of gap analyses or comparative analyses with existing certification programs. And if you look at the Salmon-Safe Standards and the Sustainable Site Standards, there is complementarity where you may be able to go deeper with some of the Sustainable Sites Initiative standards with using Salmon-Safe Standards. In terms of point system, there isn't any direct points that you would get if you were to pursue salmon safe with sustainable sites. However, that being said, you can get extra points with LEED if you are pursuing salmon safe. So with the LEED certification, if you are also pursuing salmon safe for the site, you get a bonus point under the innovation design category, and that certainly has been taken advantage of. I know our MEC sites have been very interested in that. And we also have complementarity with other programs. Built Green is another one. Living Building Challenge is another. Yeah, those are the ones that come to my mind, top of my mind. But I also wanted to pause and acknowledge that Dan Kent, our fellow executive director from the Salmon-Safe US office, is on the line. And I don't know if you wanted to weigh in on this one as well, Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Teresa, and thanks to the panelists. This has been a great session. Yeah, the only thing I would add is that Salmon-Safe, from the very beginning, our intention has been to really build on the other leading certification programs, starting on the agricultural landscape, and then as our urban work has evolved on the urban landscape, we've really looked where possible to embed Salmon-Safe standards or harmonize standards with other programs. We've done that mostly on the agricultural side with efforts with Demeter Biodynamic, for example. Now any North American biodynamic operation includes Salmon-Safe certification. On the urban side, U.S. Green Building Council, just to add to Teresa's comment, years ago, U.S. GBC reviewed Salmon-Safe and ruled that it goes beyond even LEED Platinum with respect to water quality protection, habitat conservation. And so that's why that innovation point is awarded for projects that achieve Salmon-Safe certification that are also pursuing LEED. But again, our intention is really to provide a bioregional standard that focuses in on those water quality, habitat impacts on native fish and aquatic ecosystems that aren't necessarily addressed or addressed only indirectly by these broader national or international sustainability-driven certification efforts.
Thanks, Dan. Okay, awesome. So our next question is from Jenica Javison, and this question's for Tasha. So I guess first of all the question is the Invasive Species Council of Metro Vancouver a public body? And then the second part of the question is, Tasha, would you be available to sit down and talk with the City of Vancouver about integrated pest management?
Thank you. So the ISCMV is a not-for-profit organization. There are actually a number of regional not-for-profit organizations who focus on invasive species management, as well as the Invasive Species Council of BC. And our management structure is a little bit different, but my particular agency, the ISCMV, is a not-for-profit organization. And absolutely, yeah, maybe we can chat offline. Maybe the host can send me your contact information. And I do training and support and consulting with a number of the land managers within Metro Vancouver, including the City of Vancouver. I don't think we've met in person, but I know many of your colleagues, so it'd be great to touch base.
Awesome, thanks, Tasha. And absolutely, yeah, we can help facilitate that. Yeah, so maybe I'll open it back up. I'm wondering if maybe Patrick, if you would be interested in giving an example of a project that you worked on where you think the Salmon-Safe standards got applied like really interestingly or in an innovative way.
Yeah, so I have been involved in, I guess this is an urban standards project, but I have been involved in some of the follow-up work that's come out of certification of the Vancouver International Airport as a Salmon-Safe certified site. And obviously being on an island in the middle of the Lower Fraser River and the Fraser River estuary has meant that, you know, the activities that go on at the airport have the potential to both impact fish habitat, really sensitive fish habitat, and also to benefit, things that the airport could do could also have large benefits to significant stocks of salmon in the river. So, some of the things that have come out of that is changes to the way that water quality is managed at the airport, and updates to that process. I know some of the feedback they got on their pest management programs have been really sort of changed their approach in terms of the types of chemicals that are being used, and trying to phase out some of the chemicals. And so that the process of going through certification really made them aware of where they could make improvements. Where I have been involved is more on actual enhancement project planning. So they're actually looking to, incorporate within the airport a number of habitat enhancement projects specifically focused on fish habitat, which I think is great. And, that's an example of a larger scale project, obviously, but I think, it's showing that undertaking a Salmon-Safe certification can really help understand the impacts that a site is having, and really where there are multiple points to make improvements. So I think some of the work that's come out of the airport, and again, I think it also highlights that this is an ongoing process. So the Salmon-Safe certification process, it's a 5-year certification typically, but then there is an opportunity for renewal, and so there's opportunities for continuous improvement and incremental change. And I know, that as an example, the airport is wanting to recertify, and so they will go through the process again and get new information on how, from the assessment team, on how they can best make further changes to further benefit fish habitat and reduce their impacts.
Awesome, thanks, Patrick. So we have another question, from Jennifer again. So first of all, wondering if we can give an idea of the cost to a project to become Salmon-Safe certified. So yeah, I'm going to toss this one to Teresa first.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Jennifer. It's also a very common question that we get asked, how much? This is all great, but what is the cost? And there isn't any specific costs. It really depends on the site context. So we scale the cost of doing an assessment process and certification depending on how complex the site is. So to give you an example of the BC projects, MEC headquarters in the False Creek Flats of Vancouver is going to be a different site context than, say, a YVR airport. And so the costs will be scaled differently depending on the complexity. But I also did want to pass it over to Dan, who we've been working with on the cost issue in Vancouver. And so Dan, I don't know if you can provide any insight into this as well.
Well, yeah, I guess the only thing I would say in terms of cost is that our fee structure is site-based, and it's really informed by the complexity of the project and scale of the project. And really, it comes down to the investment in terms of science team effort over time, with initial assessment and then, of course, verification. Salmon-Safe certification, it's a 5-year certification cycle with annual verification of any conditions to that certification. Typically, the fee is a single fee. It's an assessment fee. And then if a project is certified, there's no additional cost for annual verification in that continuous improvement aspect of Salmon-Safe that's been referenced. And public sector projects definitely are, we've typically taken those at a much lower margin or zero margin with the goal of really building the presence of Salmon-Safe certified projects on the landscape. So I guess, that's, in terms of general sort of what informs our costs, our fee structure for Salmon-Safe, I think that maybe provides some framework.
Yeah, and just to build off of that, and not trying to dodge your question too much, Jennifer, because I know that you're really seeking a metric, as I'm sure others are on the call, but it's just so hard to give a baseline when we don't know what we're looking at. So really, typically what the process is getting in touch with us if this is of interest and you have a particular site in mind, and then we go from there. You get a little bit more of a detailed briefing on the process, what's involved. You tell us a little bit about the site that you're thinking of, and then we start to work out, oh, okay, well, that's this level of complexity, and we can give you the fee structure at that time. So it's really a case-by-case basis, and it really is just reaching out to us and having that beginning conversation.
Awesome. Yeah, and the second part of Jennifer's question is, are there any municipalities that have incorporated certification into their bylaws? We don't actually have any municipalities that have incorporated the certification standards or the certification process into their bylaws yet. But there are some examples in the US that I'm hoping Dan can share. If you're...
Yeah, well, I guess, three ways really that we engage with municipalities. The first way is through salmon-safe assessment of individual or system-wide certification of like parks, for example. We've, starting with City of Portland more than a dozen years ago, been working with parks in terms of system-wide assessment and certification over 250 or so park sites, 10,000 acres. So that's one very meaningful way that Salmon-Safe engages with municipalities, and that really has led to more recently an initiative citywide Salmon-Safe certification, where we look at a city's impacts in its watershed with respect to everything from development practices by the city to ongoing operations, from everything from how fire trucks are washed to graffiti removal to new buildings to, really you name it in terms of city operations. And we've now gone through this process with, on the larger city scale, City of Portland over 3 years, working with an independent science team. And then most recently, just in the last 18 months with City of Shoreline, just north of Seattle. And then a third way we've worked with municipalities has been, and maybe this really gets to the intent of the question, has been building salmon-safe incentives as a beyond compliance approach with municipalities. In other words, for developers that take on green infrastructure that goes beyond regulatory mandates and achieve salmon-safe certification, can be expedited permitting, reduced fees, greater floor area ratio, so higher density projects. And we found that that can be a really important part of the value proposition for developers in considering salmon-safe certification. And we've pursued that approach with primarily Puget Sound area municipalities, cities like Redmond, Bellevue, Shoreline, jurisdictions like Thurston County in Western Washington, just to provide some examples.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dan. So yeah, that's going to wrap up our Q&A period. And yeah, we just wanted to thank everyone for joining this webinar. As we mentioned at the beginning, this was the third and final webinar in this series focused on the Urban Development Certification Program. So stay tuned for more information about our next webinar series, which will focus on salmon-safe certification for agriculture operations. This series is scheduled to begin in spring 2020. So we'll be posting a recording of this webinar online, so it will be available for you to revisit or share it with colleagues who weren't able to make it today. Also, a reminder that our first two webinars can be found online, which go into some more detail on the Salmon-Safe program and its benefits. And we also have a short survey, so please share some feedback with us if you have an extra minute so that we can continue to improve our communication. There are 5 short questions, and it should take you about a minute to complete, and it should pop up once this webinar ends. Finally, a huge thank you to our presenters. We really appreciate the time you've taken out of your busy lives to share your knowledge and experience with us. And so that concludes our webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.